Good morning and welcome to the Microsoft track. This morning we are discussing reimagining digital inclusion and accessibility in healthcare. But first, some introductions. So my name is Shona Wright. I lead the public sector marketing for Microsoft UK and I'll be your moderator this morning. I'm joined by Hector Minto, Microsoft's technology evangelist for accessibility, assistive technology and disability. So welcome, Hector.
Hey.
And alongside Hector, we have Rob Heath. Rob is an account exec in our healthcare team and also a Microsoft accessibility champion. So welcome, Rob.
Hi.
So to frame the conversation today and to get us started, we're just going to play you a very short video.
My daughter recently had a very serious medical condition. This was a very scary time. Gabby had a seizure, which she's never had before, and within 15 minutes, we found ourselves at the hospital. We had lots of information coming at us from many different directions. As a blind person, I needed to have access to information only available to me in print. We had my wife at the hospital with my daughter. I was traveling back and forth on a daily basis. Both of us needed to be able to access all of the information at all times from different devices. Fortunately, in my case, I use Office 365 both personally and professionally. I was able to quickly use my phone's camera to scan information available in print.
Ready. Double tap to capture.
So if a doctor handed me printed articles, I was immediately able, using Office Lens, to add that information to my ever-growing OneNote notebook. I was able to focus on my daughter. I was able to make sure I had all the information I needed. Good news is Gabby's doing very well. She's thriving. She's back in high school. I couldn't be happier about what OneNote has enabled me to be able to accomplish. And I think that by making it accessible and by making it usable by all, what Microsoft has done is opened up limitless possibilities to people.
So really powerful video there, I think you'd agree. So to pose the first question, what do we really mean when we talk about accessibility and digital inclusion when it comes to healthcare? So Hector, I'll pass that one to you first.
Thanks, Shona. So look, I think when you watch that video, the reason we shared that particular video as opposed to just a routine video about accessibility was to show you the independence that Steve got from just having tech that worked for him. He wasn't saying, I need everything to be accessible. He was saying, give me a toolkit of things, you know, his OneNote, his OneDrive, his optical character recognition on his phone. And he was saying, I can make the inaccessible experience accessible. And that's really where we're going with accessibility. Think of it as almost like digital dexterity, putting enough tools in the toolkit to allow people to work in their own preferred way. And the other reason we shared that video is whenever we talk about accessibility, people start to freeze a little bit. And they think, oh no, this is a compliance conversation. Yeah. What you see there is we extend the conversation beyond the actual patient. You know, the doctor working with Steve's daughter wouldn't necessarily know that the father was blind. So the point here is that it's incumbent upon us to recognize that every single stakeholder using technology today, whether it's a dyslexic nurse, a blind parent of a patient, or the patient themselves with limited physical dexterity, we have to constantly design in with those personas in mind when we think about the technology that we use. And the great news is that the toolkit that we're building at Microsoft is expanding. So this call today, I've turned on translator.microsoft.com. You can join this conversation in any one of 65 different languages concurrently just by going to translator.microsoft.com and typing in the join code JQDAW. That would allow somebody to join with live captions in this conversation, even if the platform that we're using today doesn't offer that service. So this is really where we're going with accessibility. It's this idea that everyone can work in their, you know, and gain access to healthcare in their own way.
Perfect. And Rob, you're working with our customers on a daily basis. Would there be anything else top of mind for our customers at the minute?
Yeah, definitely. So Hector spoke really well about the way that we're engaging with patients, but also the way that staff are working together now. Times have changed massively in the last few months, as we all know. So previously, a conversation could take place between two people within a healthcare setting just by walking over and having a conversation, whereas now, maybe in remote locations in different spaces, and that interaction can't take place. So the way that the tools that are available to the healthcare space now are used to enable collaboration in an accessible way is something that trusts are talking to us about an awful lot at the moment. The way they're bringing in digital practitioners and creating champions, and the way that people are just not only getting hold of the tools, but really building on those tools to have great experiences with staff and indeed patients.
I think there's also an
Brilliant.
interesting, sorry to butt in, Sharon, but I think you bring up a really good point in kind of the new times that we're working in through this COVID crisis. Is put a real focus on accessibility. I really remember very clearly when Matt Hancock stood in Parliament and said, look, wherever possible, patient consultations will be digital. Well, not if they're not accessible. Yeah. And then if we sit there and think, well, hang on, patients with disabilities have to come into the hospitals. Patients without disabilities can join a digital consultation. We can't go there. Yeah. So it really has brought into key focus this concept of, what is digital accessibility and who has access to these great new ways of communicating.
And I think that brings me on to a phrase that I often hear you quote, Hector, and that is that digital transformation must be inclusive. Do you want to kind of elaborate on what you mean by that?
I think you've got to roll it back to the drivers for digital transformation, right? Everybody's sitting there going, we've got to go digital now, and think of all the efficiencies and the productivity we can win, and the different ways of delivering our services. And that's great, but you'll be held back if you don't make it inclusive. It will literally stop your digital transformation if you have a cohort or a subset of stakeholders who you have to kind of still maintain the old way of working with. So, what we've discovered through all of our work on this topic over the last few years is those who take a diverse perspective to their digital transformation, focus on the inclusion or focus on who's going to be excluded within those design principles, they will go much quicker, much cheaper, and they'll end up just designing a product that just works for, that actually sets itself apart from its competitors in this market.
Yeah, I agree. I think the amount of conversations I've had with customers over the past few months that started off in January, they were talking about things that they just couldn't do digitally. And by April, it was the norm. It happened so fast. But if you take that back to the people plan that was released and updated in August, one of the only paragraphs talks around how we foster a culture of inclusion and belonging. That has to be part of the digital transformation process. You have to think around how you do that. And I know we'll talk about inclusive design later, but really, when you're looking at digital transformation, you've absolutely got to have inclusive design at the heart of what you do. You can't retrospectively bring it back and re-engineer something you've already done. You have to start off with that at the beginning. And it's great that the people plan has that line really, really early on.
But recognizing the disability you have within your own organization and giving it a voice, allowing it to feed back on what works, what doesn't work within the tools that you're creating, just means that you just go much quicker and drives this culture of inclusion. Gartner said in 2019 that the CIO will be the person who drives the most culture change, as in the tools that we've got available to do our work on a daily basis, they're going to be the things that drive positive workplace culture.
Yeah, so one of the things that we do talk about inside Microsoft a lot is accessible by default and the concept of when you have to ask, you miss out. Rob, how are your customers framing their thinking about this at the moment?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We're finding lots of cohorts coming to the fore all the time. So where previously digital was something driven by the CIO, and Hector, I completely agree with what Gartner is saying. We're now seeing pockets of people that are choosing to use digital because it's the best method of communication and collaboration across the way that they work. So we're seeing those people pop up and having a voice around what they need from the digital tools and how they need to be accessible, how they need to work in a way that enables them to be the very best that they can possibly be. So that's really a big shift, a paradigm shift that we've seen across our customer communications recently.
Hector, on that, so much of disability is kind of, difficult to bring to the forefront, isn't it? So how do you take it back to some of those kind of fundamental principles?
Yeah. So what we've come a long way on this inside Microsoft. I mean, it's fair to say that the tech industry at large fully saw disability inclusion and accessibility as a compliance issue. There are laws and regulations, and let's build our tech to that standard. What we're now seeing is that the human relationship with technology has fundamentally changed, right? How many of us wake up with our phones under our pillows? I mean, probably terrible for my health. I'm sure it is, but my relationship with my tech is completely different from my watch through to my phone, through to my PC, and I expect my services to be digital first, right? And as that happens, we then have to recognize 70% of disability is invisible. Vast majority of people don't share their disability. Okay, so people losing their hearing, even to their doctor, will not be talking about that at the start of them losing their hearing. So this idea that we have to be explicit and transparent and discoverable on accessibility, understanding that 1 in 6 of the general populace and a much higher proportion of the medical populace, the healthcare populace, have disabilities. How can we not have digital accessibility as a skill set within health? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. But our learning is move beyond compliance and really start to tackle it as great design that works for everybody. That's really what accessibility is, as well as the fundamentals. And maybe we can come back to some of the testing and making sure that something is legally accessible in a moment.
Yeah,
Sorry, some of the things that we've seen customers do as well, but have really built on that, taking it away from compliance and creating excellent experiences. So look at what's happened in Rotherham, where they've engaged with the speech and language therapy cohort, where they're engaging with patients in a totally different way, and the benefits are huge. The DNAs have reduced. The patient satisfaction has massively changed because they're not having to commute and put them in difficult scenarios. And actually, the outputs are better. The benefits are just huge from taking the accessible tools and changing the way a conversation takes place between a practitioner and a patient. And they've just done it off themselves. And we've also got loads of scenarios where translators being used heavily now, in the way that people who don't have English as a first language, you're using tools within Teams to translate conversations in real time to make an experience totally different, and interventions are coming to the fore a lot quicker as well. And then we're also seeing in the back office the way that there's a person in a trust in the Northeast that I worked with previously who's severely disabled, and using some of the tools that we've been able to provide him specifically, he's now able to collaborate and be his very best as a real valuable team member. And he's got some amazing skills, and he makes a great difference to the team that he's in through the tools that he's able to use now. Loads of different things like that taking place.
Not least giving that empathy of the patient experience, right? When you've got that internal muscle, it builds that empathy that lets you kind of understand much clearer about your requirements, and what you need to build to drive successful technology adoption with your citizens and with your patients.
Completely.
But you've talked a little bit about the compliance side of it there, but we'd be remiss not to point out that there are requirements around public sector organisations to meet certain accessibility standards, and that has to be a good step forward, right?
100%. We're fully supportive of rigorous standards on accessibility. Now, the new regulations, the latest iteration landed on September the 23rd, so just a week ago. All backdated public sector websites now need to be accessible legally, right? Now, you can test those using some of the tools that we've got available to you, just to get an idea of how accessible your website is. But start with that concept of, if you don't know if your website's accessible, it's not. It just isn't. Yeah. So the new regulations are interesting, though. They widen the conversation out beyond web to all tools, website delivered tools in the workplace, public sector workplace need to be accessible. The apps that we build must be accessible, and the documents that we provide on any public platform need to be accessible. Yeah. Now, what that means is there's got to be some education here about what digital accessibility actually means. So some people watching that video with Steve earlier will be watching him using VoiceOver on his iPhone, accessing his OneNote, and that might be the first time they've ever seen a blind person access an email. Now, if you don't know how people use these things, how can you actually start building for accessibility? So having that representation, that understanding, but recognizing that the laws that are coming through are recognizing the wider scope. Yeah, not just website. It's every digital experience that you deliver needs to be legally accessible, and you must have an accessibility statement. Now, for those people supplying into the health service, that is going to start becoming that supplier requirement on you. If you're delivering something on behalf of the public sector, you need to be legally accessible. So this is not some kind of, nice to have legal requirement, but the nice to have is just those huge productivity wins, those cost savings when people can just access the settings. I have one quick anecdote on this. I've known one lady with ALS, motor neuron disease, in London for 10, 12 years. She's a long time, person living with ALS. And we joke about how she used to have to order her blue badge for her car. Previously, she had to go down to the offices, the government office. There was no ramp to get in the building. She had to literally have stuff carried out to her in the car park for her to then give authority to sign. Now they delivered an accessible website, and she just does the whole thing in 5 minutes on her own. Take that social cost saving, yeah, and then extrapolate it out to 1 in 6 of the general population. This is why these regs are critical.
And actually, it's more than the regulations, isn't it? It's the human impact that changing that experience has on that person, and how they show up as a member of society, and how they feel valued as a member of society.
And how they feel about you. So every person with a disability who comes across an inaccessible website, your value set is just immediately, impacted. How their opinion of you is impacted. If we there's this quote we use from TD Bank in Canada. They say it's like turning away 1 in 5 of your customers and just saying we don't care about your needs. It says a lot about your brand and what you're delivering to the public when you're overtly accessible, not just legally accessible. Deliberately inclusive, deliberately accessible.
I think the great example, Hector, is we spoke about this before when they first started the COVID briefings. And we got the 3 people stood there talking with no accessibility tools whatsoever. There was no sign-in, subtitles, any of that taking place. And there was legal action threatened against the government for not providing that. And that's a great example of, forget compliance, which is really important, it's great, but there's actually a social duty for us to go and make sure we're delivering things in an accessible way.
Yeah. And I think sort of like building on the sentiment there that, it's, compliance isn't necessarily the driver, but it does bring forward sort of digital inclusion as front of mind. And actually that creates a whole bunch of opportunities for us, doesn't it? Especially in kind of the AI space, for example. What are your things that are really standing out to you at the moment, Hector, in kind of that space and the possibilities for the future and where it might go?
Yeah, so just roll it back to what AI, from a kind of a human aspect, the human qualities of AI. Think of it like that, without ever saying about, AI is like not a replacement for human, but the things that technology can do now through AI are bridges for human experience. So computer vision can support human vision. Yeah. Computer translation can support human understanding, right? So machine learning or image recognition can support somebody who's blind with kind of description of that object that they're looking at. Okay, so we're applying artificial intelligence on a regular basis to a ton of hacks, looking at our own product. So you can't look at M365, Windows, Office, Teams now without recognizing the impact AI is having on those products, even just down to the search functionality in there, right? It's using AI to just deliver that better experience for humans. Extrapolate that out to the humans who require some kind of bridging in terms of the access. So what we're seeing is things like Seeing AI can now read human handwriting for somebody that's blind for the first time, or can read human handwriting for somebody who's dyslexic. Yeah. So we're seeing the AI being imaginatively applied to look at new ways of working, and that's something we're actually funding. So we have something called AI for Accessibility. This is a program where we actually say, look, to all the innovators out there, if you think there's a way we can use AI to deliver better experiences for people with disabilities to access modern life, we really want to look into kind of helping fund some of that work with Azure credits and things. So we look at AI and accessibility as a really kind of sweet spot for innovation.
And Rob, to sort of take it back to real customer examples, that's some fantastic work, Hector. But where do organisations get started? How do you get on that journey?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that we're starting to see asked more, which is great because people are thinking about it. The reality of what people are using right now is probably mainly focused around what's happening within the tools that we provide as first party. So things like presentation designer and accessibility checker and those kind of things that are readily available to people in the NHS now through the central deal that's been signed to provide Office 365 to the NHS. So they're there and ready for you to start using. But we're finding that that's getting people thinking around how they can start designing this way forward. So within the Azure platform, we've got loads of different things we can bring to the fore, cognitive services and like that will enable you to build tools that you need in your organizations to go and bring some of the AI to the fore in an accessible and inclusive way. So we're really open to those conversations, and we're having those conversations both with customer and partner in terms of how we take things to market with them and make sure that things are more accessible.
Yeah, and I think, just from either of you here, can you kind of just point out one or two scenarios which kind of bring to life this for people who are sitting there going, I've never heard of any of these tools, or I don't know, I don't know where to start looking.
Yeah, let me start with maybe a scenario, and I think it's a really good way to look at it actually. When we think of kind of exclusionary scenarios that exist on a daily basis within healthcare settings, like how might we apply AI to actually unlock that, or change somebody's perspective on that situation? So think of something like a blind person signing a medical consent form. What actually happens in reality now, in that situation? The doctor will come and say, look, we need medical consent for this. Can you sign this document? Blind person, quite rightly, should be able to say, well, what am I signing? Now, in a pre-AI world, that piece of paper is completely inaccessible, right? So somebody's probably going to have to sit and read it out to somebody and make sure they kind of understand it all. We know in reality that's not going to happen, right? We speak to the community all the time, and we know this doesn't happen. In an AI-first world, that person can literally whip their phone out offline with no data sharing, so there's no kind of privacy risk here. Can literally whip their phone out, hover their camera over it with Seeing AI, and that text will be read out to them straight away through their phone, right? So it changes the perspective on the situation. The conversation now moves to, okay, here's your medical consent form, whip your phone out, read it to yourself, I'll be back in 2 minutes and let me know that you've signed it, right? That's a completely different scenario that AI unlocks. And I love these examples because they force clinicians to kind of think about the holistic needs of that person. Blind person's going for an operation, it could be their tonsils, but their vision is stopping them from being, from signing that medical consent form. AI is that unblocker. Okay. Now, that's just one example.
Building on that, take a dyslexic patient who's presented a form to complete before containing medical information. So helping them understand what's actually contained within that form so they can present and read back the right information. Tools like Immersive Read have the ability to break that form down, separate the words, highlight adjectives, nouns, so on and so forth, present pictures for certain words, change the colour context. Again, if someone has any challenges visually around colour blindness, the way that you can use that to help them as well. It just changes the way that people are able to interact and provide the information that they need to get the best level of care. Back to what I said right at the start, with staff as well. We're not restricting accessibility needs just to patients. It's within the NHS community of 1.3 million people. How we enable great people to go and actually interact with the information you provided and just not put a form in front of you. You've now got to write in. We can help you. We've got AI tools that can help you do that.
Really important. Recognizing that lived working experience with a tech inside the NHS is going to be so important. What a size of an audience, to go at with accessibility tools. I mean, I can't wait.
I think the biggest one we've seen really is probably the multidisciplinary teams for MDTs and the way that specialists have had to come together from different spaces to work, whereas previously they'd all be in one room. And the tools that we've been able to give now have meant that they can share information, they can provide their knowledge and their experience to help patient outcomes in an accessible way, recording a video, translating it and annotating it back into Stream so that you can see the transcript of a conversation translated if you need to. All of these sort of things are happening daily now, and it's great to see. Really, really good to see.
But don't ever forget the basics as well. You know, it rolls back to things like magnification, right? You know, all of these are just skills that people need to have to deliver equitable experiences. And the more the skill and the more that we model it on a daily basis and we show good accessibility, the more that people kind of find their best way of working. Like Steve, you know, who trained Steve to access all of that information? He discovered it. He found that stuff just worked for him, and that's what we're pushing towards.
Yeah. And so we're pretty much at time now. So Hector, what would be your parting comments to sort of leave our audience with today? And then Rob, I'll come to you for some kind of, what can people actually go and do?
So we really want to share our journey at Microsoft on, you know, moving beyond compliance into opportunity and recognizing that wider, you know, user base for tech that just exists out there. So we now have completely reorged accessibility within Microsoft, and our 4 pillars are culture. We need leaders from the top saying digital inclusion is a must. Yeah, accessibility is a value that we must, you know, dig into at all times, and disability representation is key to our success as a business. Yeah. Then we reflect on the systems that we have in place. How does somebody book leave? How does somebody fill in their weekly report? How does somebody log into work? Are all of these tools routinely accessible, and do we know how accessible they are? Then focusing on the product. Every organization has a product. Yeah. Is it accessible, and how does this feed? How does that representation and reflection feed into product? And then that last innovation piece, you know, just sort of saying, stop looking at this as burden and obligation and start seeing this as opportunity to just really innovate for everybody. That's really the approach we're taking.
Yeah.
And so Rob, what can our audience sort of go do to further their understanding or even start their journey of sort of digital inclusion and accessibility?
Yes, probably 3 things just to finish off for me, and these are 3 things to go and search in Bing or your favourite search engine, I guess. AI for accessibility, Hector already mentioned it previously. Go and have a look at what that is and the work that's going on in that space. Really open your mind to what's possible there and how you can bring that into the things that you do. Accessibility Insight is tools we have available and we make freely available to help you check the compliance piece. So is your website accessible? Hector said earlier, if you don't know, it isn't. So use that to highlight where you've got gaps and how you can improving it. And also your applications, your public facing applications and also your internal applications. One's compliance, one's best practice. But use that tool, run it through the applications, and it will help you understand what you can do to improve the tools that you use in your organization to improve their accessibility content. Finally, if you do one thing off the back of listening to this session, go and sit a piece of training called Accessibility Fundamentals. We've made it available. We at Microsoft have it internally, and around about 60% of the UK have gone and taken this course off their own back. It's not mandated to us. It's something we encourage people to do. Present it to your boards, present it to your senior leaders, present it to your whole communities, and get it to really open your eyes in terms of what's possible, what digital can do to help people in different ways. It's the best 2 hours worth of learning you'll do, and I really strongly recommend, if nothing else, go and do that and open your mind to what's possible.
Thank you. So that brings us to a close. Thank you, Hector and Rob, for both of your insights today and for joining me for the last 30 minutes or so. We welcome questions to any of the team here in this or the broader Microsoft community, so feel free to reach out either via this platform or to connect with us on LinkedIn. And so thank you all for your time and enjoy the rest of the great lineup that we have today. Thank you.
Thanks all.